Hi everyone, my name is Morantes Africano. I am a teacher educator working at Newcastle College. I am also completing my doctoral research at the University of Glasgow. My presentation critically interrogates norms related to gender and sexual diversity that I argue partly enable the reproduction of inequalities experienced by LGBTQ plus people. I invite you to engage with it from a personal and professional points of view and to reflect throughout on your values and experiences around the issues discussed. I chose this image on the right to illustrate aspects of power, especially if you work as an educator and the difference that you can make to the lives of those you come in contact with. I reclaim here the idea of the gay agenda. This presentation will start with a brief rationale, followed by a conceptualization of habitus against gender norms. Then we'll discuss aspects of power, and we'll finish with some implications for education and educators. I want to start with clarifying that the use of queer in the title of the presentation relates to gender and sexual difference. It acknowledges non-heterosexuality as natural and diverse, with a range of identities and expressions. I use it with celebration and pride to counter the stigmas associated with sexual difference, although it is important to avoid imposing labels on those from gender and sexual minorities who do not identify as queer. Statistically, UCAS and Stonewall report that 1 in 13 UK applicants identify as LGBTQ+, and 1 in 200 identifies as transgender. 12% of LGBTQ students reported having negative experience in school. This means that 9 out of 10 did not report a negative experience. However, 17% of transgender students did and attributed bullying as the main reason. In the UK, there has been a campaign that has been going on for years about banning conversion therapy. The World Health Organization removed homosexuality as a disease in 1990. Yet, in this country and in many others, sadly, people are still trying to cure it. I argue that this is grounded on a received discourse that heterosexuality is normal and the rest is not, therefore needing to be changed. Conversion therapy includes medical, psychiatric, psychological, religious, cultural, or any other form of intervention trying to change or cure gender and sexuality. Figures from the UK governments show that 7% of LGBTQ people, 10% of asexual people, and 13% of trans people have been offered or undergone conversion therapy. I am a strong believer of the power of the UK's Equality Act. However, we need to go further with it beyond compliance and tolerance, because technically LGBTQ people have at least the possibility to access education, but that doesn't mean that they are welcomed and accepted by teachers and peers. As a teacher educator, I have experienced teachers being conflicted with trans and non-binary students, especially in some STEM and vocational subjects. I believe that this is because it's new to all of us, and we have new understandings of this. There is new language, and this needs to be part of our professional learning as educators. This is why I am focusing my doctoral research on belonging as a guiding principle of inclusive practice. Now, regarding conceptualizations of heteronormativity, we need to divide this into halves, hetero and normativity. I will pause for you to read these two definitions. In many contexts, it is assumed that heterosexuality is the foundation of society and that it is normal, whereas any other form of sexual identity and expression may be considered the opposite. Fortunately, not everyone, but the vast majority of people do. One of my main concerns is people in power, like politicians and policymakers, but also educators. This is why I believe we need to talk about power, and I need you to reflect on your spheres of influence. However big or small you may see your role in education and larger societies, you have a lot of power, and I invite you to use it with kindness and compassion. Habitus is an incredibly complex concept to define, but Bourdieu and Passeron defined it as the processes of early socialization that develop long-lasting dispositions that generate ways of thinking and doing in social spaces. Our upbringing influences our way of thinking and acting. I suggest that habitus is also a moral classifier. It's a system that helps us to organize experiences and navigate the world. From a very early age, we put children in clothing that is gendered, ways of play that are gendered, and praise or chastise children for their gender performance. Television and other media are also big influences. And personally, growing up, there was not a big representation of gender and sexual diversity, or at least not represented as normal. And that part of life and those messages permeate on us and become part of what we understand life to be. So a lot of us just do not understand queerness because we were brought up with notions of it being abnormal or in some cases morally wrong. Butler's work has been very influential in my understanding of the power of the binary. So the notion that people should be heterosexuals to be accepted in the social space is inculcated through family, friends, religion, and so on. Now, the problem with these norms is that they are not rules or laws. They are not written. They are not publicly available. They become a grammar of social interaction. And these habitus, when it comes to gender and sexual difference, may lead to othering people because we do not understand them. This image comes from a demonstration in the US, but sadly, the very same thing happened in London just a couple of weeks ago. Um, a group of people from religious backgrounds was trying to convince a massive crowd that they were wrong, which interestingly comes from a habitus that is normatively inclined to believe that gender and sexual diversity is wrong. These people care about others, and they are probably feeling mortified that these people wearing rainbow flags are going to be condemned because this is part of their belief system. We act based on what we know. So if as educators we're acting from a place of ignorance, this is what happens. Therefore, I suggest that learning about gender and sexual diversity is needed to disrupt the inequalities that minorities experience across the world. The image on the right here comes from a gender reveal party invitation. The reflection here is whether before a baby is born, their gender will influence the color of their room and their clothes and toys and the parents' expectations of what being a boy or a girl means. It is important to unpack the heterosexual matrix. This is one of the takeaways from this presentation for you. There is a difference between sex, gender, and sexuality. They are all different but interconnected. I highlighted in red here sex as the visible part of the male and female biological configuration. The other two, gender identity and sexual orientation, are internal and for many invisible. We need to think about gender as a spectrum of expressions that range from the masculinity to the femininity and vice versa. This also means that within a male body we can have femininity, and within a female body we can have masculinity too. Sexuality is also about desire. This is why it's important for us to acknowledge it as sexual orientation, not as preference. We can also have sexual attraction and romantic attraction. So love doesn't know gender sometimes. And regarding sexual desire, there is no choice. It's part of one's internal configuration. It's important to reflect, for example, about toxic masculinity, where there are narrow definitions of what makes a male a man. The same applies to women and societal expectations about them. This, in some cases, can be damaging to us because the moment that we impose on people our beliefs of what a man or a woman should be, we are negating them sometimes the chance to be who they are. I have here one of my students as an example. Tony's gender is non binary, so their pronouns are they, them. My habitus associates Tony's female face with a female pronoun, and I have had to recalibrate my brain to associate Tony to the non-binary gender identity. This is an exercise that takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. My point here is that we need to be kind and compassionate with ourselves, as this may be new to a lot of us. Now, the alphabet soup conflates sex, gender, and sexuality into one acronym. This is the spelling of the long acronym. And I have created this table to problematize this a little, because the moment that you start with LGBT people, we start thinking about alternative sexual expressions, and sex is an intimate thing, therefore being private and not something that we should be talking about openly in social spaces like the classroom. I understand when parents, for example, reject any form of LGBTQ talks in schools because they associate sex and children may be too young to learn about that. But apart from that, we need to talk about gender expressions, rights, and love. So having gender mixed with sexual orientation, mixed with biological configurations doesn't help. Sadly, I don't have an answer to this, but I will continue exploring ways to highlight that knowing about this is important for everyone, everywhere. Now, regarding symbolic power and symbolic violence, they are interlinked in that the imposition and inculcation of a cultural arbitrary is done by an arbitrary mode that we call education. I would add that this carries normative aspects of right and wrong. And from that point of view, any form of inculcation is a form of violence on people. But you was mostly talking about class, for example, when the middle class values are the values driving education, when we may judge working class students as not being academic enough or not bringing the cultural capital or the credentials that will make them successful academically. But from that perspective, we may be part of the reproduction of inequalities. Now, I have two main claims here. Please read them. And basically arguing that the discourse of immorality associated with being born as in a sexual minority is received rather than innate to nature, and also that it harms everybody. So we need to reflect on that. And in terms of symbolic violence, I want you to reflect a little bit on the symbolic power that you have as an educator. You have the power, for example, to assess your students, you judge their work, and you give them a grade, and those grades are carried with the student as their value. Regarding morality, or what we believe to be right or wrong, for example, regarding gender expression, the symbolic violence happens when we judge others if they don't conform to our belief system. As a thought experiment, I think about what if you had been born in a context where having blue eyes was considered morally wrong. You would be wearing contact lenses to hide your blue eyes, but deep inside, you know that you have blue eyes. And this forms an internal conflict within yourselves. Because if a lot of people around you, media, friends, family, are saying that that's wrong, there is a point where you just have to stand up for yourself and say, well, I have blue eyes. So the reflection here is how pride really is a reaction to the idea of shaming people for who they are. And I argue that actually this harms everybody, the judged and the judged. So in order to disrupt the reproduction of inequalities, I invite you to become an ally to matters of social justice. Stonewall reports that 1 in 5 students are still experiencing hate crimes and incidents. And the Government Equalities Office reports that um, those problems are happening across schools, colleges, and universities. And part of the issue, I think, is because this kind of phenomenon is not part of educational agendas. It's seen as something that belongs in the private sphere, not something being significant enough to do something about it. So we need to make this, an educational issue, but also to create educational spaces as safe spaces where all students feel that they belong, and we may not understand them, but we care about them. I finish with proposing a few ideas to disrupt inequalities associated with gender and sexual difference. The first one is that we need to value all humans from a fundamental equality point of view. If we stripped away sex, gender, race, class, and so on, and see humans as humans, we start awarding them equal value and respect and concern. The second one is acknowledging that queerness exists in the world. It's not a pathology or an abnormality, and relates to the last one, which is that our habitus is flexible, it changes, and education has a part to play for us to critically question those normative views that we have inherited from our upbringing. How? I've got three starters for you. So the first one is to involve others. Invite them into your classrooms and give them a platform to promote positivity. The second one is the use of pronouns. This can be very powerful and can open up conversation for students to share aspects of their identity. It's also a welcoming gesture. And the last one is about yourselves. Be compassionate and kind with yourselves, because as I, have been saying throughout, don't judge yourselves too hard. This is new to a lot of us, and we may have received understandings about sexual diversity. Fortunately, we can see now also how young people are being more aware of this, and hopefully there is going to be something brighter for the future. At the same time, we are experiencing ultra conservative leaders around the world passing laws that are regressing fundamental human rights, and we have to use education to resist that. As homework, I encourage you to watch this clip from the Umbrella Academy. This is what I'm talking about in terms of queering habitus. Elliot Page, the actor, transitioned from female to male, and Netflix decided to incorporate this as part of the program. In the program, his family accepts him fully, and there is a lot of symbolic power in this, especially for young people who can contemplate that it is okay to be trans. Three key points to remember. The first one is that a habitus that is heteronormative is morally oriented and that generates dispositions towards queer people that, if they are unexamined, can lead to forms of violence. The first one is that those negative dispositions that we may have acquired at, from an early age may be received more than innate to human nature. And the last one is that because part of the problem is learning and those received discourses, education has a place here to disrupt these inequalities. We have the power to make educational spaces more inclusive. Thank you. Please do email me at leonardo.morantes-africano@ncl-coll.ac.uk, or you can tweet me at La Morantesa.